Okay, so welcome everyone to our Nexus seminar series, which is a collaboration between UNU Flores and TU Dresden. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Blagoev to today's session, who will give us a presentation on a temporal lens against the clock, a temporal lens on organizing for business sustainability. And just to give you a little bit of background on Blagoy, Blagoy is currently a professor at Dresden University of Technology, and his focus is on organization studies. As you can already see the link in the title, and prior to joining Dresden in June 2021, Blagoy was a researcher and lecturer, postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at Leuphana University, as well as Freie University Berlin, and a visiting scholar at Copenhagen Business School. He conducted his PhD with the title A Working Time Machine in Lock-in, a path dependence perspective on the persistence of extra long working hours in a management consulting firm. And what I thought was so nice here is to really see the topic that has gone through the time and is still with you on the temporal lens and the time perspective. So with this, I'm very happy to hand over to you, Blagoy, to guide us to today's presentation. And as usual for everyone, if you have any questions, you can, during the session, put them into the Q&A session, and usually we'll wait until the end to start to answer them and to go through them. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can post that into the chat function. But any topical related questions, please use the Q&A. Right. With those small introductions, I will now officially hand over to you, Blagoy.
Thank you very much, Samanthi, for the introduction and for the kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here virtually and present to you some of my ongoing research, basically. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I hope, can you see my slides?
Yes,
perfect. Perfect. So the title of my talk today is Against the Clock, a Temporal Lens on Organizing for Business Sustainability. And this talk draws on an ongoing 4-year qualitative study of organizational change towards sustainability at a large automotive firm, as well as on some conceptual ideas developed in a systematic review paper, which is now forthcoming in the Journal of Management. So I chose to present this topic and this project, of course, first of all, because I think it fits very well the Nexus seminar series and the overall focus on sustainability, but also because it ideally illustrates some of my research commitments as an organizational scholar who adopts a temporal research lens on organizing in the context of the grand technological, ecological, and societal challenges of our time. Now, you're probably asking yourself, what is a temporal research lens? And I will come back to this a bit later on, but just to give you a brief primer, a temporal research lens basically is a research perspective, not a theory, but more of a meta-theoretical perspective, which foregrounds time as a fundamental and multifaceted dimension that pervades and shapes processes and practices of organizing in subtle yet profound ways. And adopting a temporal lens enables scholars to draw on time-based theorizing and temporal concepts such as timing, time horizons, spacing, temporal structures, from various disciplines, both from management and organization studies, but also from neighboring disciplines such as the sociology and philosophy of time, in order to shed new light on various contemporary challenges of organizing and illuminate previously neglected temporal dimensions of phenomena. And the project I present to you today deals with one such challenge, a challenge that you are all probably very, very familiar with, and which has perhaps become the central concern of management practitioners, but also scholars of organizations, and that is organizing for business sustainability. Now, as I see it, time is basically at the center of business sustainability. Although sustainability is often equated with the accounting framework of the triple bottom line of financial, social, and ecological performance, the notion of sustainability is deeply rooted in ideas of intergenerational equity. And intergenerational equity entails a core temporal tension at its heart, and that is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the capacity of future generations to meet their needs. And that is also how research on business sustainability has increasingly started to define the notion of sustainability in this temporal terms, as, for example, here done by Banzai and Desjardins, who define business sustainability as the ability of firms to respond to their short-term financial needs without compromising their or others' ability to meet their future needs. Now, from this perspective, business sustainability basically fundamentally concerns this ability of the firm to balance the short term and the long term, or in other words, the near and the distant future. For example, in the near future, companies may face significant financial costs in retooling their production lines and investing in renewable energy, which can put pressure on their short-term profits and make it more difficult for them to compete. On the other hand, in the more distant future, the shift to renewable energy will likely lead to significant environmental benefits and improved long-term performance for companies that are able to effectively transition. Now, if we accept this idea that sustainability is defined as the ability of the firm to balance the short and the long term, then it follows logically that temporal imbalances between the short term and the long term are among sustainability's greatest threats. Now, prior research has revealed that such temporal imbalances are particularly likely to occur among organizations that adopt what time researchers call a clock time orientation. A clock time orientation is basically defined as a view of time that is discrete, linear, measurable, divisible, precise, deterministic, and subject to only one interpretation. This is basically our everyday understanding of time as flowing from the past through the present to the future in an equal way, in a universal way, time as an objective dimension of reality, which we can measure by using clocks, hence clock time. Now, this temporal orientation, though dominant in the Western world, has been shown to cause various forms of temporal imbalances for multiple reasons. First of all, a clock time orientation can lead to an emphasis on speed and efficiency rather than sustainability. Companies may therefore prioritize rapid expansion and growth, cutting corners and streamlining processes without considering the long-term environmental and social impacts of their actions. Second of all, a clock time orientation can also lead to temporal discounting, meaning that companies ascribe more value to immediate results rather than distant long-term outcomes. Now, this practice or tendency of temporal discounting is indeed embedded in various financial tools, such as the discounted cash flow method, which basically puts a financial discount onto future incomes and values incomes or cash flows which are closer in the future more highly. Now, this narrow focus on the present or the near future can basically lead to a very unbalanced approach to business decision making, where long-term consequences are ignored or discounted. And finally, a clock time orientation can also lead to a very low tolerance for uncertainty and a lack of resilience in the face of the sheer complexity of sustainable transformation. This means that unanticipated roadblocks and delays can cast doubt on the long-term viability of new sustainable technological paths, while simultaneously granting time for short-term incremental improvements of existing unsustainable technologies and practices, hence prolonging their lifetime. So basically, with a clock time orientation, people are less likely to tolerate the uncertainty which is inherent in large-scale social transformations, such as the transformation to a sustainable economy, for example. So overall, if we summarize, prior research on time and business sustainability suggests that the dominant clock time orientations among Western organizations favor short-termism and hence constitute a key obstacle to accomplishing business sustainability goals. By implication, corporate short-termism has become the object of widespread criticism in the business and academic world. Now, what is interesting, however, is that over the last decade, an increasing number of organizations have responded to such criticism by embracing distant future sustainability goals in their strategic narratives. So as illustrated on this slide, such organizations typically articulate science-based decarbonization targets in which they make binding commitments 15 to 30 years into the future, in most cases without clearly knowing how to reach those targets. In certain industries, such as chemicals or automotive, such targets can only be reached by means of radically disrupting established business models, technological paths, and organizational practices, which basically puts the organizations who make those commitments in a kind of a paradoxical situation in terms of continuing to do what they have been doing all along, but also committing to disrupt this very path on which they have been in the past. Now, while it might be tempting to prematurely condemn such targets as mere forms of greenwashing, we might be better advised to see them as instances of what scholars of organizational communication call aspirational talk. Now, aspirational talk is defined as organizational self-descriptions to which current practices cannot yet live up. Because such aspirations often serve to motivate new and better practices, they tend to be formulated as productive idealizations that ignore differences or gaps between the statement and its current organizational reference. So basically, it's inherent in aspirational talk that organizations commit to something or make a promise about something to which their current practices still don't live up. That's in the nature of aspirational talk. Now, even more importantly, aspirational talk has been shown to be performative in the sense that the very act of publicly committing to a distant future aspiration can set a baseline expectation against which organizations can be held accountable, thereby making organizational members more likely to live up to their promises simply by knowing that critical stakeholders are likely to hold the organization accountable for the promises it has been making. Therefore, articulating distant future sustainability aspirations could be an important step toward addressing the temporal imbalances and the corporate short-termism just discussed, as well as ultimately paving the way toward business sustainability. At the same time, and this is the entry point of my study, a commitment to the distant future does not mean full ignorance of what happens in the near future. That is, organizations must continue to develop strategies and strategic plans that define specific guidelines for actions in the near future. By implication, this poses a new question to management research, which, with respect to how corporate actors can become better at connecting their aspirations for a distant zero carbon future with their short-term actionable strategies, which usually are not based on a zero carbon aspiration. So if such connections do not materialize, distant decarbonization goals risk remaining detached from organizational action in the present and ultimately appear as unattainable. To unpack this problem a little bit further, it's useful to highlight that distant futures are qualitatively and not only quantitatively different from near futures. This means that temporal distance is not simply a matter of measurable duration or length in time, but rather a question of how actors construct the future. That is, what qualities they ascribe to it. This is an insight that comes from construal level theory and psychology, which basically makes the argument that people ascribe very different qualities to phenomena depending on whether they perceive those phenomena as psychologically distant or near to them. So near futures are typically construed in terms of continuity and extrapolation based on present and past experience. So people simply assume when they construct a given phenomena as a near future phenomena, they assume that there will be a high degree of continuity with what has happened in the past, and they can basically extrapolate and kind of make predictions about the near future based on their present and past experience. As such, near futures are usually evaluated on criteria such as feasibility and actionability. So people ascribe more value to near futures that are perceived as feasible, so easy to turn into reality, and actionable. By contrast, on the other hand, we have distant futures, which are usually construed in terms of disruption and imagination of alternative possibilities. So here, people are treating phenomena as psychologically distant in the future when phenomena are seen to be very different or discontinuous with their experience from the past and present. As a result, people also tend to assign more value to distant futures based on criteria such as desirability and possibility. So distant futures are valuable when they are perceived as desirable, no matter how feasible or actionable they might be. By definition, this implies that whatever actors define as desirable might seem as unfeasible in the near future, and vice versa. What is feasible in the near future is oftentimes undesirable in the long run. This means that organizations that articulate aspirations for a distant carbon-free future face an ongoing tension between the desirability of their distant future goals and the feasibility of near future actionable strategies. Achieving both at the same time is challenging because on the one hand, an overemphasis on the near future might constrain organizations' ability to imagine future possibilities that are significantly and radically different from the present, which is necessary for accomplishing sustainability goals. On the other hand, an overemphasis on the distant future might constrain an organization's ability to maintain a sense of continuity with its present and past. Such sense of continuity is essential, however, for establishing an organization's autobiographical credibility as an agent who possesses the necessary knowledge and capabilities in order to turn the projected distant future into reality. So if an organization completely ignores its past and present and near future and commits to distant futures which are perceived as completely detached from what they have been doing in the past, people, critical stakeholders, and audiences might perceive this as too strong of a disconnect and basically claim that the organization does not possess the necessary knowledge or capability to turn this projected future into reality. Now, this insight has prompted me and my co-authors to focus on the said tension between feasibility and desirability and address the following research question. How do organizations navigate tensions between desirability and feasibility when adopting distant future decarbonization targets? Or put a little bit more bluntly, how can organizations continue doing what they have been doing all along? So for example, selling diesel cars, while at the same time committing to disrupting and discontinuing this very same line of action. For example, by aspiring to become a sustainable mobility provider. And in addressing this question, in our project, we adopt a temporal research lens. And just to give you a brief overview of what a temporal research lens entails, I have brought this illustration, which comes from a systematic review paper that is now forthcoming in the Journal of Management, in which me and my co-authors have tried to systematize the literature that uses time as a research lens. And basically, the idea of a temporal research lens is to use temporal concepts in order to illuminate various management phenomena and to illuminate the temporal dimensions of those phenomena. Now, there are three different types of temporal research lenses in the literature. First of all, the most dominant one is the idea of time as a resource. This is a temporal lens, which focuses very much on the question of how can organizations get the right timing, pacing, and time horizons for their activities, often driven by the idea that organizations need to adapt to their competitors and market demands and choose the right timing, the right pacing, the right time horizons. Then there is the time as structure lens, which is focused very much on the question of how to create and maintain temporal order in organizations. It's a more sociological perspective, which basically focuses on how time manifests in organizations as a socio-temporal order that facilitates coordination by shaping the rhythms of organizational activities. And this is a lens which can be used, for example, in order to analyze how organizations temporally coordinate their action towards sustainability goals. And in our paper, we mostly focus on a time as process lens. And what is particular about the time as process lens is that it foregrounds the interplay of past, present, and future in organizing. So the idea is to focus very much on how actors and organizations define, navigate, and interrelate the dimensions of the past, the present, and the future in their everyday activities. Central interest here is how organizations confront various and changing challenges in the present, which may make them reimagine the future, rethink the past, and reconsider the focus of their present activity. The key question here is, how do actors enact a sense of continuity or discontinuity among their past, present, and projected future activities as they move in time? And this is the perspective that we take in our paper, seeing time as a process. Now, in terms of methods, we have opted for a qualitative research design, which is particularly well suited for unpacking complex process dynamics, such as the tensions between the near and the distant futures that I just mentioned. And our study is based on in our study, we chose to focus on Alpha Car, and Alpha Car is a large automotive firm which has recently launched a comprehensive decarbonization strategy. And due to its historic dependence on fossil fuels, automotive, of course, belongs to the industries that are most strongly disrupted by the sustainable transformation, and hence most likely to experience the tension between desirability and feasibility just described. At Alpha Car, this tension became apparent in seemingly paradoxical statements, such as, "We need to sell SUVs now to become more sustainable in the future," which to me constituted an empirical mystery. How could notoriously fuel-hungry SUVs possibly contribute to reaching distant future sustainability targets? And to resolve this mystery, I collected and triangulated with my co-authors among multiple complementary types of data, including over 2,200 pages of archival material, 26 interviews with managers and employees at Alpha Car, as well as industry experts and former employees, and also over 100 press articles, which overall amounted to an extensive data set that covered a period of 27 years. We analyzed this data by following the analytical strategy of temporal bracketing, which involved breaking down the process data into distinct phases by identifying crucial turning points in the development of the firm's strategic narratives about sustainability. Thereby, I specifically focused on coding how members' perceptions, constructions, and experiences of time are reflected in their languages and patterns of communication, hence focusing on coding temporal assumptions and orientations in sustainability-related discourse. And one of the first things that struck me when analyzing the data was a key shift in how AlphaCar approached sustainability, which occurred around 2019. Up until then, AlphaCar approached sustainability with what can be described as a near future orientation. That is, it adopted sustainability measures as a reaction to regulatory pressure and basically extrapolated sustainability targets that appeared feasible. That means fairly easy to implement from the perspective of the status quo. For example, AlphaCar's first formal sustainability strategy from 2010 focused on identifying potentials for energy saving in various business areas and defining corresponding targets and KPIs with a horizon of 8 years. As explained by one of our interviewees, the question was very much, what is your potential for energy saving? And potential means economically feasible. Based on this, we derived the energy targets or environmental targets. That's how we used to do it so far. Within this initial phase, AlphaCar did not commit to radically disrupting its so far highly successful business model, in economic terms, highly successful, of course, a business model that was based on the production of combustion engine cars. Its efforts were instead focused on maintaining this successful path for as long as possible. Now, a decisive shift occurred following the industry-wide Dieselgate crisis, which prompted the company to initiate a process of strategic and organizational change. In 2019, AlphaCar publicly committed to the Paris Climate Agreement targets of a full decarbonization across its entire portfolio and life cycle of vehicles until 2050. And the entire life cycle of vehicles means, of course, not only the production, but first and foremost also the use phase of vehicles, which amounts for around 90% of the carbon emissions of each car. For the first time, the company basically embraced a distant future goal that laid 31 years in the future. This commitment triggered an internal process of reorganizing sustainability activities. So, for example, AlphaCar merged the previously separate departments, corporate strategy and corporate sustainability, to highlight its new commitment on a structural level. It also reimagined its future organizational identity as a sustainable mobility provider rather than an automotive manufacturer. Decarbonization and the transition from combustion engines to electric drives was established as the #1 long-term priority for the company. Hence, in my analysis, I focus specifically on this period following 2019 in order to illuminate how AlphaCar navigated the implied emerging tension between the desirability of its new aspiration and its feasibility in the near future. And I have to mention here that, of course, this dominant near future orientation was very much still embedded in various practices and structures at AlphaCar, even though there was this emerging new orientation towards the distant future, which was initiated following the industry crisis. This tension was basically further accentuated by the fact that AlphaCar's near future strategic plans remained focused on selling fuel-hungry SUVs to match projected consumer demand, as explained by this interviewee. We have a trend in the industry that many customers are not necessarily buying the smallest cars, but want to drive SUVs. And SUVs are not necessarily the eco-friendliest. So there is a clash with the climate discussion. We have clearly positioned ourselves to become carbon neutral, but we also need to find a way to fund the whole thing and cash out. And in terms of cashing out, we need to look at what customers want and what they are willing to pay. So let's look at how Alpha Car approached this tension in more detail. Even though the analysis is still ongoing and we are basically currently in the process of finalizing our coding, I would like to present to you a process model that emerges from our data. And the core conceptual idea of the model is that organizational actors can discursively manipulate the construction of the present time horizon, alternating between a view of the present as a short moment in time, compressing the present, so to speak, and a view of the present as an extended period with a certain temporal depth, which can be conducive to seeing current tensions as temporary, as well as the distant and near future as interdependent. So the starting point of the model is the tension between desirability and feasibility, just described. Our data show that the emerging focus on desirability prompted actors to engage in what we call dechronologization of time. That is, instead of constructing the flow of time as a forward movement from the present towards the future, the new 2050 goal enabled actors to imagine time as a backward movement from the distant future towards the present. Right? So as one interviewee explained, the transport sector must be largely decarbonized by 2050. That means it must be carbon neutral. And then we said, well, if we take that seriously, then we must set that as a target now and then translate it backwards, right? So this is precisely this inversion of the arrow of time from the future to the present instead of our regular everyday understanding of time flowing from the present toward the future. This dechronologization of time accentuated the gap between the desired future state and the present state of affairs. The present, that is, the strategic focus on combustion engines and the half-hearted adoption of electric cars, appeared as a possible constraint or obstacle in light of the desired future target of full decarbonization. Becoming more sensitized to the scale and scope of this gap, actors, especially sustainability managers, began to compress the present. That means discursively construing it as a very narrow moment in time, a short window of opportunity, we could say, that demands immediate action to address the experienced gap. For example, one interviewee explained how now is the right time for not just an incremental product innovation, but a radical product innovation. If we want to be successful as a company in the long term, or even exist at all, then we must change a lot. Compressing the present fostered a shared sense of urgency among Alpha Car mid-managers. There was a widespread consensus that immediate action was necessary here and now. And by implication, this sense of urgency also shifted Alpha Car's attention away from desirability towards near future concerns surrounding feasibility. Or in other words, the question, now that we have agreed upon 2050, how can we translate it into an actionable path towards the future? This attentional shift implied what we call a rechronologization of time, basically reverting back to our common sense view of time as a forward movement from the present into the future. This rechronologization enabled actors to, first of all, stretch the present, that is, construe it as an extended period of time that reaches back into the past and also forward into the future. At Alpha Car, this was done, for example, by backcasting near future milestones and creating roadmaps based on projections of what needs to happen to secure the realization of the 2050 goal. In addition, AlphaCar discursively evoked continuity with the past, selectively highlighting early attempts to develop more sustainable forms of mobility and cars, such as the so-called 3-liter car launched in the early 2000s. Now, what's interesting here is that back then, this project was considered a failure, and now suddenly, in light of the new distant future goal of sustainability, it was reconstructed, evoked again as something that AlphaCar should build upon, and as a valuable source of experience that can provide AlphaCar with a sense of autobiographical credibility and fuel beliefs about AlphaCar's capacity to realize the envisioned path towards a sustainable mobility future. Overall, stretching the present enabled actors to transition from viewing the present as a tension-ridden obstacle to decarbonization towards imagining a trajectory into a carbon-free future in which current tensions no longer matter. As explained by one of our interviewees, our portfolio of processes and products can or will change significantly by then. What does production even mean? Perhaps there will be no production in 2050 because we are a service company. This imagined trajectory again shifted attention away from feasibility towards desirability, prompting actors to go full cycle again as unexpected tensions and delays emerged along the way. Indeed, the danger of fallbacks persisted, especially as AlphaCar realized that enacting the envisioned trajectory required more fundamental renewal in organizational capabilities, especially surrounding IT and software development. To capture this oscillation between compressing and stretching the present, in our paper, we developed the concept of presencing and theorize it as a form of narrative temporal work that enables organizations to imagine, interrelate, and enact distant and near futures in the ongoing present by manipulating the construal of the present. At AlphaCar, presencing supported the process of strategic and organizational renewal by facilitating a view of the near future and the distant future as interdependent rather than oppositional, prompting actors to make seemingly paradoxical and to a certain extent also questionable claims such as decarbonization is coming, but to reach this long-term goal of decarbonization, we have to sell SUVs now. Now, at the same time, this very statement highlights what in the paper we call the temporal trading trap. That is the danger of overstretching the present when actors oscillate between a view of the present as a short moment in time and as an extended period. Basically, what we observed that in certain cases, the shift of emphasis to feasibility bears the danger of overstretching the present by engaging in temporal trading. So, for example, there is a danger that actors might start using sustainability goals, distant future goals, as an excuse for prolonging the existing unsustainable technological paths and paradoxically reframing the relations between the future and the present, as in the quote that I just cited, basically enabling certain actors within the company to claim that it's necessary to prolong the period in which, fuel-hungry SUVs are being sold, because the company needs the cash thus generated in order to fund and finance the transition towards sustainability. Now, it's quite obvious, I think, that this form of temporal trading basically is dangerous for sustainable transformations, because it might lead to a situation in which actors continuously overstretch the present and push back the accomplishment of the distant future sustainability goals further and further away into the future, until probably at some point it might be too late. So, wrapping things up, what are the core contributions and implications of our study? Well, first of all, perhaps for research on organizing for business sustainability, I think one of the main contributions of the paper is to research that tries to develop a temporal lens on organizing in business sustainability, and also enhancing current understandings of temporal imbalances and how they occur. The notion of presencing that we develop in the paper offers a new understanding of how organizations can transition from a dominant clock time orientation with a chronological view of time, and which views the short term and the long term as oppositional, to a more complex view of time that enables actors to step outside of the linear chronological logic of clock time, and instead to emphasize different temporal horizons and relationships between the past, present, and future. Second, our paper also adds to research on time and temporality in organization studies by exposing the narrative practices through which actors can manipulate the construal of the present and its temporal depth as either a brief moment in time or an extended period. Hence, our study also shows that the construction of the present that the constructions of the present are not static givens, but rather can be strategically manipulated, raising concerns about who is manipulating them and also to what ends, further highlighting this danger or risk of temporal trading and overstretching the present. Finally, our study also offer implications for organizational practice for business practitioners. More specifically, it highlights how practitioners need to approach sustainability transformations not only as technical or regulatory issues, but more importantly also as cultural issues. Cultural orientations to and narratives about time, though often invisible or implicit, matter very strongly for how actors approach distant future sustainability goals. So overall, the paper also illustrates the power of a temporal lens on organizations and organizing, especially when it comes to revealing often invisible temporal dynamics that constitute, maintain, and transform organizational phenomena. So here I would like to make a cut and perhaps open up the floor for questions. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Blagoy, for sharing these insights. It was very interesting to follow you, and I will open the floor for questions now. So if the audience have any questions for Blagoy, you can just enter it into the Q&A session. And so I really enjoyed following your presentation, and at the end, you kind of answered a little bit my questions in terms of you were involved with one particular company that you interviewed, and I wondered if you gave them, as a feedback, very specific advice in terms of how they can change the current way of engaging with sustainability. I understand a little, like it goes into the direction of your last comments for practice, but did they ask you for feedback, and were they interested in how they can implement this? Is there anything that you can report?
Yes and no. So we have provided some feedback, but this is already some time ago, and the project has moved on since then. So I mean, they are aware of some of the findings, yes. I cannot tell you much about what they have done with it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have a look at the chat. So in the Q&A session, there just one question popped up from Stefan. And so the first question is, if discounting is a problem for sustainable behavior, how else should companies make intertemporal decisions? Do they need a different instrument? Or a different discounting function, like a hyperbolic function? So that's the first question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a good question. Well, so we know from other studies, not from this study, that companies that use, let's say, only quantitative forms of evaluating the future, such as discounted cash flow methods, tend to navigate very strongly to the short-term orientation. So this has been established by a number of empirical studies. And there are other studies who show that companies which complement quantitative techniques such as discounted cash flow by more qualitative techniques such as scenario planning, for example, tend to develop a more complex temporal perspective. For example, developing an understanding of the future as being multiple and there being multiple different possibilities, which can be helpful and supportive in addressing intertemporal tensions. For the reason that they no longer see the long-term and the short-term as oppositional, but rather start to see the interconnections between the two time horizons. So this is what research has shown. But probably I think it's a good question that also can be addressed by future research in terms of what kind of instruments or tools can be developed to address these problems with, let's say, the standard techniques or tools that are in use.
That's actually a question about tools next, also from Stefan. Can temporal lensing or presencing also be used to develop a concrete evaluation or management tool for companies to bring together long-term goals with short-term behavior?
Yeah, well, I think it could, yes. I think the general message here is that companies need to engage more with, or first of all, acknowledge that time is more complex than they assume. And second of all, approach more systematically the question of what are actually desirable futures towards which we would like to move. And then the question of how can we translate those desirable futures into actionable strategies that would lead us there. Which is a different approach from more traditional scenario planning, for instance, which is more focused on, I would say, or embodies more of a near future perspective in the sense that it's what are probable scenarios, possible scenarios that we need to be prepared for, but doesn't really address this question of what's actually desirable, not only from the company's perspective, but also at a societal level. So what are future states which are desirable at a societal level, and how can we work towards those futures? So I think that, of course, our paper is mainly, focused on making a conceptual contribution, but I think the conceptual ideas that we develop might be helpful for practitioners to and inspire practitioners to experiment with new tools that go into this direction. Yes.
Thank you. The third question is also from Stefan, and that's about the optimization problem between short-term unsustainable behavior in order to generate resources that can be invested in a transformation cannot be dismissed out of hand for companies as well as for societies. Adaptation to climate change versus avoidance of climate change. The solution remains difficult. Without resources, there is no transformation, only destruction. So is temporal trading necessary?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a good question. I think it's to a certain degree, of course, it's necessary. The paradoxical situation here is, of course, that what we find disturbing about this specific form of temporal trading here is that we are talking about, those companies could have, they could have had the option to, let's say, develop their strategies in a completely different direction, not towards SUVs, which are extremely fuel hungry, which are more expensive to produce because they, you need more steel to produce them and so on and so forth. And then they consume a lot of fuel when people drive them. So what we find traveling here is that in a paradoxical, there is something paradoxical about the ways in which distant future sustainability targets are used by actors to kind of legitimize them selling more SUVs now, because that's very profitable, and kind of pushing away the emissions that are caused by those SUVs. Because in the end, we have, I don't need to explain this to you, but we have a certain amount of CO2 carbon emissions that we can afford if we want to reach the Paris Climate Agreement goals. And of course, the more SUVs are being sold now, the less or the smaller the remaining carbon budget is, right? So it's to a certain extent paradoxical that they say we need to sell more SUVs now in order to become sustainable in the future. But of course, the more SUVs they sell now, the more difficult it will be for them to become sustainable in the future. So I think, of course, the issue that they highlight in terms of, well, we need to fund this transformation, we need resources for the transformation. Of course, that's an issue, but how they try to resolve this issue, I think it's very problematic.
Thank you. Thank you for this insight. And the fourth question, also from Stefan, goes into the direction: is aversion to uncertainty only a disadvantage for transformation? The continuous improvement process, Toyota has proven its worth, while revolutions have rarely achieved anything good through exaggeration. So I think the question is, in the first one, is aversion to uncertainty only a disadvantage for transformation?
No, certainly not. I think, well, this goes a little bit back to, there is this, we know from research on organizational change and transformation, organizational learning, that there are basically, we could say, two different modes in which organizations can prepare for change and transformation. And one mode is basically trying to improve on what they have been doing all along, which is, oftentimes contains little uncertainty and is based more on incremental improvements. And that's a little bit what you describe with the Toyota example, which is great in terms of prolonging and kind of extending what has happened in the past into the future. The issue is that if organizations engage only with this mode of learning or improvement or change, they might be extremely unprepared for more disruptive or radical forms of change. So the companies or organizations would become better and better at what they have been doing all along, but then suddenly there is a shift or a change in the economy or in their market or in the natural environment, which is so disruptive that they actually need to start doing something entirely different from today to tomorrow. And without managing this shift, or without a high tolerance for uncertainty, companies would not be able to engage in those forms of learning and change which are necessary to master this more radical transformations. So it's a certain dilemma here, right? So I could invest in becoming better at what I have been all along, or I could also invest some of my resources into exploring new things, which is more uncertain. And I need a high tolerance for uncertainty to engage in those more explorative activities, but I need to do it because without this, when a radical shift occurs, I would be unprepared and I could not respond to it adequately. So in a way, both is needed, right? We need activities which are designed to tolerate high degrees of uncertainty. And we also need activities that are designed with low tolerance for activity, where we don't want to have errors, where we don't want to have failure or certain form of disturbances, but simply want operations to continue and go on as they have been going on in the past. But the challenge again is how to do both and how to integrate those different activities. and how to do both at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll include the question from Edel just now. So Edel is asking, did you also find evidence that short-term incentives and the compensation of managers conflicts with long-term perspectives of sustainability?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at this in a systematic way, in like a quantitative, we haven't done a quantitative analysis on this because we don't have the data, but there is other studies which have found such evidence in the past, yes.
And so the next question from Stefan is connected to the management as well. Could you find out whether company management and company owners have different ideas of the desirable future?
Mm-hmm. This is a good question. Well, I would say that between the owners and the management, of course, there were some differences in some of the details of what's desirable, but there was a widespread agreement about the need to fundamentally go away from combustion engines, right? This was something that was not being discussed anymore. So this was, I think, something that also surprised us when we started. We expected, given the history of the German automotive industry, that it would be a much more controversial topic within the company, that different people will have different views, and some would say, well, we need to prolong this or continue, producing combustion engine cars in addition to electric cars. But this was actually not the case at all, which surprised us very much, that they really didn't debate on this anymore. They agreed that this needs to happen, and then they were more debating and discussing on how they can accomplish this, right? And then there were different views about the details of how this can be accomplished in, let's say, a way that's not only ecologically and financially sustainable, but also sustainable in the social dimension, stuff like this, right? So then there were different, let's say, shades of how they defined what's desirable.
Thank you, Blagoy. I have one follow-up question for what you just described. Is that you were quite surprised that there was such an agreement for the desirable futures or the long-term goals? And I wondered, in retrospect, do you have an idea why they all agreed on kind of this perspective?
Well, I think it's a couple of factors. First of all, the industry crisis was quite recent when they decided to do this. So they were they were in this shock situation, right? They were still very shocked about what had happened. And then they were quite committed and saw the need, because it also had very, enormous financial consequences for them. So they were quite determined not to let history repeat itself. And then quite quickly, the consensus emerged that one of the ways to or the best way to make sure that this would not repeat itself would be to transition to electric cars, because this would be the future of mobility, and this was the technological path that they settled on very early on. So this was one factor. I think that the context in which this had happened was still very much shaped by the very recent memory of the industry crisis. And then there was a very strong push, I think, for this also by the top management at this time. So there was a very strong commitment by the top management to do this, which was voiced both internally and externally, so both towards internal audiences and external audiences, and was perceived as a very strong binding commitment expressed by the top management, which could not be discussed away anymore. So this was, I think, also for many employees that we interviewed who were not, at the top management level, but let's say mid-managers, middle management, for them it was quite important to see and hear this binding commitment by the top management, because this meant for them they need to take this seriously now. Now it's out of the debate, out of discussion.
Thank you. Maybe I have one last question. And was the desirable future of electric cars also discussed controversially, or was that kind of then a desirable future without much reflection?
No, not really. Well, I guess there were some critical voices, but not really, no. You mean in terms of battery production and stuff like this? Yeah, no, that was not something that they discussed on a large scale. Yeah.
Thank you. And then we have one last question from Matthias, and Matthias is asking, the amount of electric vehicles will not be in the magnitude of current cars due to resource restriction. Is this discussed?
I mean, I would say so. They were aware of this issue, of course, and that's also the reason why they imagined, the future of mobility as a shift away from the current concept of everybody owns a car, more towards, as they called it, sustainable mobility provider. So imagining more car sharing services, things like this. Yeah.
Thank you, Blagoy. So thank you very much for sharing your presentation and answering all of our questions. I very much appreciated this. I think everyone did, as you could see by the follow-up questions. There was a lot of interest in your topic. With this, I would like to close today's presentation. I would like to invite everyone who is here. And Blagoy, if you could briefly stop sharing your screen, then we'll put in the announcement of our and the invitation to the next presentation in our Nexus seminar session. So that's seminar number 72. It will be on the 18th of December at 2:50, and the focus will be water security research group of, sorry, will be on water security, and it will be presented by Dr. Barbara Willards from IASA and the IASA Group of Biodiversity and Natural Resources Program. So we invite you to register for this. We'll share the link to the registration in the chat as well. And with this, I will once again say thank you, Blagoy, for taking the time. It's very much appreciated. And to everyone, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you very much for the invitation. See you.
See you.